This week, Vladimir Putin told the Russian people to prepare for total war. Even if you're not on the front lines in Ukraine, behave as if you are. Most analysts read this one of three ways. Russia is short on manpower, NATO is escalating, or Putin wants to expand the war into Moldova or the Baltics. All plausible. But I want to argue a fourth possibility, one that goes deeper. I think Putin sees war itself as the cure for what ails Russia. War as a workout. War as the mechanism that takes a corrupt, alcoholic, depopulating society and forges it back into a disciplined nation. If I'm right, what we're watching isn't a campaign for territory. It's a campaign for the Russian soul. Start with the patient. Russia today is, in many respects, a broken society, corruption first. Russia is the most corrupt country in Europe. The rich steal and then run to Europe, to the United States, to Dubai. And the GDP shows it. South Korea, with about a third of Russia's population, has a higher GDP. Texas, one American state, has a higher GDP than the entire Russian Federation. Second, alcoholism. About 1 in 6 Russian men is an alcoholic. 1 in 3 deaths in Russia is linked to drinking, and the rate of young men dying keeps climbing. Third, fertility. The rate sits at 1.5, well below the replacement level of 2.1. Combine that with men dying young from alcohol, and since the year 2000, the Russian population has been declining steadily. If these trends continue, Russia ceases to exist as a society. The nation dies. So why is this happening? The Western diagnosis is simple. Russia isn't democratic enough. Unleash liberal democracy and Russia will prosper. Putin has a different diagnosis. He says the Russians have been lied to, deceived, and manipulated by Western civilization. The gospel of liberal democracy, freedom, human rights, consumerism. To him, these are hypocrisies that have corrupted the Russian soul. The corruption, the alcoholism, the empty cradles, these are symptoms of a civilization that has abandoned itself. To see why Putin thinks this, I need to take you through the idea he is fighting against. In the late 1980s, the Soviet Union had effectively lost the Cold War. And the reason it lost, in my reading, is that the Soviet elite gave up. They no longer believed in communism. They no longer believed in self-sacrifice for the nation. They wanted the Western lifestyle. Around that moment, an American historian working at the State Department, Francis Fukuyama, wrote an essay called The End of History. His argument, the Soviet Union fell and America triumphed because liberal democracy is the best idea ever invented. To make the case, he reaches back to Hegel. Hegel's dialectic says history is driven by a war of ideas. A thesis appears. We notice its problems and generate an antithesis. Both are too extreme, so they fuse into a moderate synthesis. That's how history moves. Fukuyama applies this to the modern era. The thesis is capitalism, which produces the Industrial Revolution, but is too extreme. The antithesis is communism, also too extreme. The synthesis, the resting point, is liberal democracy. And at the heart of liberal democracy sits consumerism. The promise is this: we exist to buy things, and as long as we buy things, there will be world peace, because consumers need to buy and nations need to produce, and nations produce best when they trade rather than fight. That is the argument Russia is fighting against. And to understand why Putin treats it as poison, I need to back up and ask a more fundamental question. Every society in human history has wrestled with the same problem. How do you optimize the workforce? How do you get every person to work as hard as possible for the collective? Historically, there have been 3 answers: war, religion, and civilization. They work because they give us structure, meaning, and purpose, and a person with structure, meaning, and purpose works harder. But each carries its own pathology. War kills. Religion can become superstition. Civilization, taken to its extreme, becomes racism. We are better than them. Which leads to imperialism, the white man's burden, and ultimately fascism, where war and conquest become the highest good. Over time, all three have become more abstract, and that abstraction is what allows mass society. Take religion. The earliest religions were polytheistic, and the gods looked like us: Zeus, Athena, Hera. Over time, polytheism becomes monotheism, and the divine becomes abstract. So abstract that more people can believe in the same thing. That same abstraction gives us a new organizing concept: money. And making money the structure of society is what we call capitalism. Capitalism produces industrialism, which produces wealth. But capitalism has problems. First, it is all-consuming. Capitalism only cares about the expansion and growth of capital, regardless of the cost to society. Profit for the sake of profit. Taken far enough, that destroys the planet. Second, capital consolidates. If each of us has $1 million, the fastest way to grow it is to pool it. Run that logic to infinity and you end up with one person holding all the money, because consolidation is the fastest path to growth. Third, capitalism alienates. To be human is to be complex, to create, to love. But under capitalism, you are reduced to your production value, to the number in your bank account. Marx, in the Communist Manifesto, points out exactly these problems and proposes a solution. Don't put money at the center of an industrial society. Put the worker at the center. What's prescient about Marx is the mechanism. He doesn't just argue this should happen. He argues it will happen as the natural next turn of the dialectic. Imagine your parents have died, and at 16, you have to go work in a factory to survive. How do you feel? Bitter, lonely, depressed, alienated. So what do? You start asking why. You develop what Marx called political consciousness. You spread your ideas. You organize. And once you organize, you realize something powerful. The capitalists need you. They own the factory, but you do the work. Without you, nothing runs. Stay united, and you can demand whatever political reforms you want. For Marx, capitalism inevitably produces alienation. Alienation produces consciousness. Consciousness produces solidarity, and solidarity produces revolution. Now, the conventional view says Marx was wrong. Communist revolution didn't happen first in industrialized Germany. It happened in agrarian Russia and China. But if you look more carefully, Marx was largely right. After World War II, every industrial society to some degree adopted his ideals. We call it socialism rather than communism, but it's the same move. Put the worker at the center. Why after World War II? Because workers create value. Money doesn't create value. Money speculates. Workers produce. So you treat them properly. In America and Europe, the worker became the central organizing unit of society. Unions could demand reforms. The whole system was geared to making the lives of the working and middle classes better. Excellent health care, great public schools, cheap universities. The 50s, 60s, and 70s were the peak of working class life. Then, in the 1980s, this changes. Why? If the worker-centered system was working so well, why dismantle it? Because the elite didn't want it. A society built around the worker becomes too egalitarian. The elite wants difference. The elite wants power and money concentrated. Historians sometimes call this the revolt of the elite. In America, we call it the Reagan Revolution. In Britain, Thatcherism, neoliberalism, free market capitalism returns. How radical was this shift? In the 1970s, the average American CEO made about $1 million a year, roughly 20 times the average worker. Today, the average American CEO makes around $20 million a year, 200 to 300 times the average worker. Inequality exploded. But you can't just go back to capital as the organizing principle, because the worker is still there. So the elite needs to dissolve the worker as a category. And the way you do that is by replacing the worker with a new figure, the consumer. The shift sounds subtle. In the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the government promised you a good job for life if you were a citizen. From the 80s on, the government promised you low prices and a wide selection of goods, subtle on paper, a revolution in practice. Because remember what the worker has to do: develop political consciousness, organize, push for reforms. Now think about the psychology of a consumer. Suppose I give every one of the 500 people in this school $1 million US. What happens? First you buy a house, then you buy furniture. Then, and this is the move, you post pictures on social media. Now your classmate sees your house and wants a bigger one. They buy and post. You see theirs and want to upgrade. Very quickly, everyone is in debt. $1 million sounds like a lot, but it isn't enough to win this competition. And everyone hates each other. You don't share lunch, you don't share homework, you compete. That's consumerism. It manufactures a competition for prestige. It atomizes you. It makes you incapable of acting together. And it teaches you to see the world only through economic logic. When you meet a potential partner, you don't ask if they're kind. You ask how much money they have. Is this how the world works today? Yes. Why are you in school? To get a good job, to make money, to buy things. Under the worker regime, school was about opening your mind, learning to think critically, training your imagination. Under the consumer regime, school is a pipeline to purchasing power. This is what I mean when I say consumerism is the perfection of slavery. A slave who knows he is a slave will rebel. A slave who chooses his chains, who enjoys his chains, never will. That is why Fukuyama calls it the end of history. It is the perfect system. The elite get what they want, and the masses neither want nor are able to resist. But some civilizations rebel against slavery by their nature. Russia, in Putin's view, is one of them. Impose this system on Russians and they don't comply quietly. They become corrupt, they become alcoholics, they refuse to have children. The dysfunctions I listed at the beginning, corruption, alcoholism, collapsing fertility, Putin reads them not as failures of democracy, but as a Russian soul refusing the chains of consumerism, while lacking any framework to rebel against it openly. So what Putin must do is free his people, even if his people enjoy their prison. And to do that, he needs a new organizing concept to set against the consumer. That concept is the warrior. The consumer is an individual who acts alone, mainly to preserve his own life. The consumer is a coward. The consumer lacks imagination. The consumer is alienated. The warrior is something different. The warrior is an individual who sees that through his own actions, through courage, through imagination, through acting alongside others, he can shape the direction of history. Back to the thought experiment. I gave you all $1 million and you ended up hating each other. Now I put you on a plane and fly you to an island. And on this island, there are millions of flesh-eating monkeys who want to eat you. What happens? You set aside the differences. You work together. And how do you feel doing it? Happy. You're working toward a shared goal. Structure, meaning, purpose. That is what war does. Now suppose one of you dies in the fighting. What happens to the survivors? She becomes a martyr. You celebrate her, you give her a great funeral, and then you fight harder, because her death gives your life meaning. And suppose one of you is on a bridge with the monkeys closing in, with 10 of your friends on the other side. He cuts the bridge. He sacrifices himself. We've seen this in war over and over. War gives structure, meaning, and purpose, and forges stronger and more disciplined people. That's the theory. So in February 2022, when Putin launched what he calls the special military operation in Ukraine, we should, on this theory, see Russian society improve. And I think we are seeing it. People are happier. People are more unified. The Russian economy is surviving U.S. sanctions. In fact, it's getting stronger because people are fully participating in the war economy. On concrete number, Russia is producing roughly 150,000 artillery shells per month for the war. Take a guess at the United States figure. The American figure is around 2,000 a month. Russia is gearing toward a war economy. Factories run hotter. More people are employed. When people are employed and have purpose, they drink less. Corruption falls. Alcoholism falls. Fertility rises. Last year, Putin was asked about all the Russians dying on the battlefield. His answer: when they die on the battlefield, we honor them. They sacrificed for their country. They are remembered as heroes. Their families love them. But if we just leave them alone, all they're going to do is drink themselves to death. For Putin, war is a mechanism for society to rejuvenate itself. War is the opportunity to cut away the fat and become lean. So this war, in his frame, isn't really about conquering Ukraine or pushing back NATO. It's about saving Russian civilization. Because if these trends continue unchecked, Russia ceases to exist. Out of this, I think a new ideology will emerge to challenge consumerism and liberal democracy, and we will end up calling it Putinism. The core idea of Putinism is continuous war. A society should be constantly fighting wars in order to discipline itself, unify itself, and make its people stronger and more prosperous. That, I think, will be Putin's defining legacy. The shift is from a society organized around the consumer to one organized around the warrior. Now, an obvious objection. Hasn't war historically destroyed societies? Athens and Sparta, World War I, World War II. Societies become exhausted. The answer inside Putinism is continuous, small-scale war. You pick small, contained conflicts. Why small? Because of nuclear weapons. You can't control escalation in a large-scale war. If the United States and Russia fight a ground war in Europe, eventually someone reaches for the nuclear option. So Ukraine, small, contained. An invasion of France or Britain, nuclear war. By the same logic, the United States picks Iran because Iran is also small and contained. This is a fundamental reframing. Historically, war was a tool to conquer others, imperialism, the spreading of civilization. Putinism says, we don't care about the others, we care about ourselves. War is a gym for the body politic. A quick clarification because someone asked. Is capitalism the same as liberal democracy? No. Capitalism only cares about capital. You can be a fascist country and be deeply capitalistic. Nazi Germany was extremely capitalistic, and it saw the Soviet Union as a direct threat. Liberal democracy is the project of having everyone participate in the generation of capital. One of the ironies of the 20th century is that capitalism and democracy are actually opposing forces, and liberal democracy is the synthesis that papers over the contradiction. Now, the harder objection. World leaders are insane, but they're not stupid. There's a difference. They'll happily kill millions. They won't blow up the world. That much, I think, holds. But Russia isn't a wealthy country. War is usually a pyramid scheme. Take Nazi Germany. Their wars cost the economy enormously, which forced more wars to fund the previous ones, which is part of what drove the invasion of the Soviet Union. They needed resources and manpower. The same logic could apply here. Putin spends heavily to fight in Ukraine. After Ukraine, he may need to conquer more territory just for the resources to keep going. In the long term, that path leads to disaster, to a large-scale war. In the short term, though, the model works. There's also the exhaustion question. Won't Russians get tired? Putin's bet is that Russians are a warrior culture. They enjoy war. They're good at it. They won't be exhausted by war. They'll be galvanized by it. And there's something to this. The Germans have fought wars well for 1,000 years. The Japanese are also a warrior culture. China is not, and I'll say this carefully, China would probably lose most wars. War would exhaust Chinese civilization. War can rejuvenate Russian civilization. It depends on the culture. So, where does this go? In the short term, war culture beats consumer culture easily. Look at Ukraine. The Russians are grinding down the Ukrainians, while Europeans are too busy watching TV, shopping, and vacationing. Consumers don't want to go to war. But eventually, Russia will threaten Germany, France, and Britain directly, and those societies will start their own transition toward war culture. Putinism, I think, becomes the dominant ideology for the next 50 years, and it can spread. Japan can adopt Putinism. Germany can. Britain can. The world we get is what we call multipolar, multiple centers of power, each with regional hegemons, instead of the current single hegemon system anchored on the United States. Now, the question that exposes the deepest problem with Putinism. Is warrior culture also a form of slavery? I'd argue it's actually anti-slavery. Why? Because warriors can do something consumers cannot. Warriors can rebel. Warriors can mutiny. The army can decide their leaders are terrible and march on the capital. Consumers don't do this. No one ever says, "I'm going to stop buying things to protest the system." Warriors do say, "I don't like this leader, let's march to Moscow." That's why warrior culture, for political leaders, is always a direct threat. That's why we eventually moved past it. And this points to the contradiction inside Putinism. For a warrior culture to function and triumph, it needs a king. That's why kings exist, to bind warriors. Putin is, right now, that king. He is, in my reading, a strategic genius. Everyone admires him. He unites the generals. He can direct the whole society toward total war. But Putin will die. And when he dies, the country falls apart, because what he leaves behind is a warrior culture without a king, generals fighting each other for total control. Civil war. That is why I think Putin's legacy will not be a strong Russia. It will be Putinism, the idea of continuous war. Russia itself may not survive without him. When you have a leader of his caliber, he is, frankly, impossible to replace. No successor will combine his genius, his authority, and his ruthlessness. A fair question. How much of Russian society actually agrees with Putin? Most people, in any country, don't want war. Most are scared of it. I'd guess at most 10% of Russians genuinely embrace Putinism, maybe far fewer. Most Russians want peace, want their children safe, don't want to send their sons to the front. But history is not made by majorities. History is made by those willing to act in unison. Look at the Israel lobby in the United States. Far less than 1% of the American population, but organized, determined, willing to act, and they get their way. Same dynamic in Russia. The most extreme, the most organized, the most determined faction sets the direction, and war itself unifies. Look at Ukraine. About half the population were Russian speakers, and at least a third were sympathetic to Russia before the invasion. The moment Putin invaded, they all united under Zelensky. That's what war does. Back on the island, you may hate each other when the plane lands, but with 1 million flesh-eating monkeys closing in, you become a family. To Putin himself, Russia is, first and foremost, a great civilization. As a great civilization, it must occasionally fight wars to defend itself. His framing, "If America left us alone, we wouldn't fight." It's because America insists on encircling us, on trying to destroy our civilization, that we have to. The war in Ukraine, in his telling, is caused by NATO encroachment. NATO was built as a defensive alliance against the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is gone. So why has NATO expanded 5 times? Why was it about to expand into Ukraine? The defense of civilization, he says, requires this war. And this is the process, this defensive necessity met with the warrior virtues, that crystallizes Putinism. Continuous war. One last contrast, because it matters. China is not a warrior culture. For most of its history, China was the dominant power, the regional hegemon, ringed by natural defenses. Sea to the east, mountains to the south and west, the Great Wall to the north. China rarely felt existentially threatened, so it never developed a warrior culture. Russia is the opposite, a vast country invaded repeatedly, traumatized repeatedly. The German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 killed roughly 20 million people, and Russians still commemorate that war. That trauma is the soil Putinism grows in. Next time, I'll get into Putin's strategic genius specifically. And what I want to show you is that the way Russians see the world is radically different from the way we see it. That's where we'll go next.